Hey everyone, back again with the last installment of at least the weapons portion of our DPS meta sandbox breakdowns. We talked about primary and special DPS already, so naturally we're going to be talking about power DPS today. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to our outline. So our outline today, once again, criteria, what makes for a good power weapon when it comes to DPS. Number 2 is going to be exotics, which are not in the best spot right now, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Then we have the 5 families for DPS: rocket launchers, grenade launchers, swords, linears, and machine guns. Machine guns are, not super relevant for damage, but I will discuss temporal blasts with stuff like unwavering duty, because that's been catching some attention recently, so I'll definitely add that in there. We have some special cases, crossbow, and then we have the summary. So let's go ahead and get started. First up, criteria. So what is actually required for a power weapon to be viable for DPS? So we have range, right? So crossbow, linear, stuff like that is going to be better for long range targets. It's mostly just, are you or are you not using a sword? Really close range bosses that stomp you a lot and not really easy to hit their crits, like Herald, for example. Obvious sword target, stuff like Riven. You want to be using a sword, right? Crota as well. And then you have crit percentage, which is like not as relevant on heavy weapons, but it's going to influence, for example, on some enemies where the crit's really easy to hit or the body is really easy to hit. In some examples, you may not want to use something like a linear, right? You may want to use something else. It's also going to obviously change whether or not you have like a div. So that can change some things too. You have raw DPS, you have setup. So some perks, for example, like rockets with Reaper's Tithe require more setup. Or surrounded, for example, surrounded on Briar's Contempt. Can't get that anywhere, right? You can't get that just about everywhere. So there's that. You have rarity, exotic versus non-exotic. And unfortunately, with how things are in the current sandbox, the opportunity cost for using an exotic heavy weapon is, it's interesting, right? Because last season we had a meta where everybody was using exotic heavies. And I literally discussed this on the channel. I was like, we're moving into a sandbox, especially for endgame consistent damage, where a lot of people are favoring exotic heavies. And then this season came where it's like exotic heavies, not to spoil anything, are a bit rough for exotic heavies right now. And I'll explain why in a second. Fire team size is up next. The smaller your fire team, the less likely you are to want to have Galahorn in it, because Galahorn does much less damage than a legendary rocket. You got 3 people, you got 2 people, you're solo. Endgame DPS, you're more than likely not going to want to use rockets and or galley. And then finally, we have total damage, which is a big consideration for heavy weapons. Not a massive one, right? As long as you're hitting like 6 digits or something like that, you're kind of fine, but it is still a consideration in some cases. So this is what we're looking for in a DPS heavy. And as a reference point, just like how in the special weapon video, I talked about how Outbreak is around 2.5k, Mint Retrograde is a much higher bar to clear. That's going to be 3.5k without temporal and 4.8k with temporal. So that's a very high bar to clear. And you're going to find that a lot of traditionally recommended heavy weapons or even exotic heavy weapons do not even come close to clearing this bar. Okay, so remember that 3.5k, 4.8k. Exotics. Already seeing some bad things here. These are the top 8 exotic heavy weapons when it comes to sustained DPS. Legend of Acreus is first at just shy of 4k. So if we go back to the previous slide, 3.5 to 4.8k. on a special weapon, on a legendary special weapon. Acreus, the top performing exotic heavy in the game right now, just shy of 4k. Prospector, doesn't work on all bosses. On a typical boss medal where like you get some of the submunitions hitting, 3.3k. Leviathan's Breath, 3.3k. Whisper, 3.3k. Blah, 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 blah. A bunch of exotic heavies, 3.3k, 3.2k, 3.2k. I'm not even going to show clips of most of these because like they're all kind of samey, right? They're all exotic heavies that have similar-ish total damage, right? 60, 65, 70, 75k, and they all do around the same DPS, right? And these exotics, some stuff like Sleeper, for example, has shifted up because of the Rain of Fire changes that I mentioned earlier. Some exotics are very greatly assisted by having Rain of Fire, and some are not assisted at all, for example, like Whisper. So that's changed some of the rankings in terms of the sustain tab, but really here you're seeing a lot of these exotic heavy weapons are faltering, even against some of the higher performing specials that aren't Mint Retrograde. So pretty rough. And then when it comes to total damage, I mean, none of these are even in the 6 digits, right? We saw stuff like New Land Beyond, which hits, might I remind you, around 3.4, 3.5k DPS with like 150k plus total damage, right? So the reserve changes that came as a part of Edge of Fate that were kind of undocumented definitely affected different weapons disproportionately. And I think one of the best examples is looking at all of these exotic heavy weapons, especially stuff like Whisper that used to be like a pretty known total damage option, right? and it's like 50% lower total damage than something like a New Land Beyond, while having less DPS, and it's a heavy. It's an exotic heavy. It's not an exotic special. So pretty crazy stuff. Let's move on to rocket launchers. So we have 3 rockets to really consider here. I didn't include any others because precision rockets now have the exact same reserves as high impact rockets. No reason to talk about them. So let's just go over the 3 that we have. We have the When and Where at 6.2k DPS, 83k total. This is with temporal. Without temporal, it's basically the same total as Hezen with a little bit lower DPS because you are manually reloading the rocket instead of using something like Envious with time loss magazine. So the When and Where, yeah, I mean, pretty decent DPS, but this assumes, by the way, this 6.2k number assumes that you're not getting a temporal blast every shot, which is technically possible, and is also not using stuff like a Reaper's Tithe or a Surrounded or a Frame of Reference. So not the most optimal rocket setup, but basically the most decently consistent rocket setup that you can get out of the current legendary options without any kind of like crazy setup. Hezen Vengeance, we just discussed this, slightly lower DPS without temporal, lower total as well. I mean, you can see here that legendary rockets, even with Pack Hunter, which is an exotic buff that boosts total damage, still having total damage problems. A lot of these special weapons that we talked about in the last video easily clear this 60, 65k, 70k mark, right? And even without temporal blast. And so, you know, rockets have always had total damage issues, and the reserve nerf definitely didn't do them any favors. Not as relevant these days anymore, to be honest with you. I mean, maybe in some challenge scenarios and definitely in some speedrunning scenarios, but there's other stuff on the table that we're definitely going to discuss in a second here. Tomorrow's Answer, I thought I'd include this in here because it technically does have higher total damage because it has more rockets than an adaptive or an aggressive, but obviously you can see the DPS does take a substantial hit, despite the fact that it has almost the same perks as Hezen Vengeance. Okay, so I just thought I'd kind of show that on this slide. Okay, next up we have grenade launchers. So grenade launchers, there's 4 of them I want to talk about. We have Outrageous Fortune, which comes in at 4.6k DPS, 74k total. This is not with the 2-shot swap method, so you're not getting optimal temporal uptime here. There's a lot of downtime because of the internal cooldown. Spike grenades, Envious, bait and switch, classic roll. Without temporal blast, you're going to see values of around 3.4k DPS, 54k total, and that's going to put this just below Bittersweet, right? Basically right around Bittersweet. So interesting that adaptives and rapid fire grenade launchers have almost the same damage profile now. Actually, they have essentially the exact same total damage, and their actual DPS rapids are like a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depends on how they're reloaded and how your timings are calculated, but they're very close now. So another consequence that we're going to talk about. I'll make an archetype tier list video update at some point that goes over some of this stuff, but yeah, that's all you need to know for now. Caraxes is Distress. This is Envious, Enhanced, Surrounded. We've talked about this before, and in the Temporal Blast video, I went over how heavy GLs are not one of the greatest like recipients of Temporal Blast, users of Temporal Blast, and this is pretty clearly demonstrated here. I mean, a legendary with no seasonal mod, 4k damage, and then Outrageous at 4.6k DPS. Not a huge difference, right? It is there, but it's not a huge difference. And then finally, Dimensional Hypotrachoid. That one is at 3.2k-ish DPS. And this is with Vorpal, by the way. If you gave this thing something like Bait or something like Surrounded or any sort of sustained damage perk, it would easily be right up there next to Adaptives and Rapids. So shout out to heavy wave frames, are maybe a little bit underrated. And now that the wave fireteam scaling issue has been fixed, they're possibly even viable once we get some better compressed waves out there, especially for bosses that potentially have multiple bodies like Graniques, like we've talked about before. Let's go ahead and talk about swords next. So swords, we have 5 swords to talk about. Now, technically, Senancia is not even released, but we know what the charge rate is, we know what the reserves should be in theory, and we know how much damage waveframes do. So I just decided to simulate what it would be like to have a Senancia with Relentless and Honing times 5. Technically, Relentless doesn't even do anything here because I'm just heavy spamming. And by just doing heavy spam with this sword in particular, you can maximize the rate at which you put out temporal blasts. And that's going to put you at 4,000 DPS with a total of 113k damage. 113k total with no ammo regen perk like Relentless, triple tap 4 times, that sort of thing. Pretty impressive, to be honest with you, but the base damage profile of just heavy spamming is 3450 DPS at 109k total, which is not great, right? That's not particularly amazing. So that's just kind of right behind, you know, Summum Bonum, which has reduced impact compared to Xananthia. So definitely, if you're not going to heavy spam with Temporal Blast, you want to stick to the classic, you know, 1 heavy 2 light combo or something like that. Bequest here, obviously a strong overperformer because of its free additional 10 impact for whatever reason. 3837 DPS, 116k total, scarily close to a Temporal Blast option. Swords, like we talked about during the temp last video, do not have a particularly impressive boss damage scaler, and so their ability to perform with Temporal Blast is definitely significantly reduced compared to the other heavy weapons here, and it's not surprising that Synancia doesn't beat out Bequest by that much, but if you're doing something like Crota DPS this season, yeah, feel free to throw on like Synancia or Aurora Dawn or something and just like spam right clicks with the Lucent Blades. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff there, I suppose. Ergo, which is the only special to appear in this video because it's a sword technically and it competes with other swords in the heavy slot. Yeah, 3.6k DPS. This is fireteam scaling, so it accounts for the fact that, you know, people don't share ignitions and stuff like that. Still pretty impressive to be outperforming something like a Summum Bonum. So basically every non-surrounded and non-temporal sword is in fact bested by, you know, Ergo. And this isn't even the best Ergo perk and frame combination. Lightweight and Vortex Telesto frame are technically better than this version. I just didn't include them because in theory they could be less consistent depending on the boss model. So really you could take it or leave it. I mean, they have better fireteam scaling. They're somewhere around 3.7k, 3.8k, I believe. Total damage obviously suffers on Ergo, but this doesn't account for the catalyst where you can like throw a grenade and the grenade take damage regenerates sword ammo. So Ergo definitely still a competitor for shorter damage phases. Just remember that Transcendence, once it runs out, Ergo damage falls off a cliff. So definitely more of a shorter damage phase or a supplemental option. Summum Bonum, talked about this. Ill Omen, this is a more of a consistency focused sword option. You know, it's a caster. It has a worse damage perk than something like Surrounded or Chaos Reshaped. But in terms of consistency, it's pretty solid. Just thought I'd put its DPS value here for people to see, because obviously the 1 heavy 2 light on Bequest and Summum Bonum require Lucent Blades to some degree, and Summum Bonum, I believe the 1 heavy 2 light combo value that I used is a little bit faster than what you can normally achieve on a typical boss model. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about linear fusion rifles next. Linear fusion rifles, not particularly impressive. Briar's Contempt, even the top performer at, you know, 3.2k DPS with 92k total, with enhanced surrounded, a 47% damage perk, is still barely breaking 3k, which is mint retrograde. Does 3.5k DPS, just so you guys remember. Linear fusion rifles were kind of irrelevant already for the most part, especially non-exotic linear fusion rifles. And this season has only cemented that even further by introducing other options that are ranged and have decent total damage and have excellent DPS in class as well. Boomslang 4FR, I mean, it is the only linear this season that you can use with Temporal Blast. So I calculated what it would be like to get 1 Temporal Blast every single burst of your shots. I use Vorpal Weapon here because Precision Instrument, for whatever reason, because it only buffs precision damage, does not increase the damage of Temporal Blast, and also Boomslang doesn't really have rewind rounds or reconstruction or something that synergizes with Precision Instrument, so I just went with Vorpal because that also increases Temporal Blast damage, and the DPS and total damage don't even beat Briar's, so not great. Scintillation with Rewind Bait, which is the option that most people are going to be using when they think of a linear that's consistent. Again, just barely above the good primaries, which is like terrible, right? And the total damage, like linears, their claim to fame has always been consistent option with div plus total damage. Look at the total damage. It's like not even breaking 6 digits, right? You need 4 times a charm on Cataclysmic, a perk that essentially doubles your total damage to even break 6 digits. So, and then the DPS is pathetic by today's standards. So yeah, linear's not in the best spot, but I thought I'd put them here for completeness sake, right? But not in the best spot. Next up, we have machine guns. Machine guns, a little bit interesting, I suppose. Normally, machine guns, not very good. Their DPS is literally worse than the top performing primaries. So their whole thing where they're like, oh, we give you a lot of total damage, and oh, we give you, you know, a lot of super generation, and then the primaries do that, but they also have higher DPS while having infinite total damage. Now, the only exception to this is, of course, Unwavering Duty, which, because of Temporal Blast, which happens to be quite synergistic with the machine gun weapon family, because machine guns have pretty solid boss scalers, you know, high fire rate, but not too high, and they're able to trigger Temporal Blast like every 10 or 11 shots once you have enough buff stacking going on. So Unwavering Duty with 4 times a charm target lock, I mean, even if you don't use Actium Warrig, the DPS is still like 3k with a total damage value of 344,000, which is, this is enough total damage and a long enough time to dump that you're never really going to run out of ammo no matter what kind of phase you're using this on. So not really relevant to even list total damage here. It's like effectively infinite as long as you can go into every phase with ammo. But, you know, it's kind of like a primary of sorts that does higher DPS, I guess. and potentially maybe does competitive super generation as well. I mean, I've heard a lot of reports from people that have told me, you know, you should have mentioned Unwavering Duty in such and such video because it's so good with Temporal Blast. And you know, a lot of those comments were on videos where I wasn't considering Temporal Blast intentionally to talk about, you know, the base sandbox without OP mods favoring certain weapons on top. But for this video in particular, I wanted to explore its boss damage potential because some people had brought that up to me. And yeah, it's not like the total damage is nice, but it's not particularly amazing. Like, I think Parasite PKs with like Yeartide is easily going to best Unwavering Duty. So we'll definitely talk more about this when we get to it. Yeah, well, I mean, I'll include Unwavering Duty in the rotation video for sure. Like 100%. I'll include that in the rotation ranking, but don't expect amazing things out of this. Obviously, the total damage number is mind-blowingly high because machine guns with 4 times the charm and target lock already have very high total damage, and just being able to add a Temporal Blast projectile every 10 or 11 shots is a big bonus to total damage, as you can see. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Obviously, Retrofit is going to be higher DPS than Hammerhead, which is going to have higher total damage, and then Archon Thunder is going to have even lower DPS with higher total damage, etc. But not really worth considering given the state of primaries that we've talked about. Primaries are literally at 2500 and potentially even higher with Temporal Blast, so nothing here is really worth considering this season except for Unwavering. Okay, so with machine guns out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about special cases. So special cases, some interesting stuff here. First, the elephant in the room, Opaque Hourglass. With explosive bolts, elemental honing ×5, you can use Vorpal here, they're almost the same value. And high reload without Bolt Scavenger. I've been told Bolt Scavenger can bypass the reload cap on the bow, so you might want to consider Bolt Scavenger, but this doesn't account for Bolt Scavenger, just has high reload and some reload multipliers. 6.2k DPS with 120k total if you just shoot all 10 bolts. You just shoot all 10 bolts, you don't even go pick them up, 120k. So already besting almost all, if not basically all, legendary heavies that are not, you know, machine guns. So insanely high total, technically infinite if you go and pick up your bolts, which most people do when they use this thing. Just, you know, insane, just insane. Like, this is up there with temporal rocket dumping, right? We listed an option earlier, Clown Cartridge elemental honing ×5 with temporal blast every other shot. This thing matches that with more total damage even if you don't pick up the bolts, and no galley required, and you can go pick up the bolts and it's like technically infinite total damage, right? So just easily like the best overall heavy weapon in the game right now for just DPS, just casual DPS on whatever you want, really insane stuff. I mean, you can see the DPS value goes down significantly without Temporal Blast at 3k/56k, which is absolutely not noteworthy whatsoever. I mean, we talked about a machine gun that's able to hit, you know, almost 3k and have much higher total damage. I mean, granted that's with Temporal, but it kind of shows you what I mean. Like 3k DPS with 56k total is absolutely terrible. This bow is 100% carried by Temporal Blast, and we've already talked about that. As for the other two exotics here that I want to talk about, Parasite, this simulates with ×20 as the first shot, and then a ×0 for every successive shot. And yeah, 6.6k swap DPS, which is pretty decent. This is with no stacks, by the way. If you have no stacks, you're shooting a gun, you swap to Parasite, you swap off. You just shoot one shot of 0 stacks between there. 6.6k swap DPS, totally good, totally acceptable. 89k total damage, which you might not think is amazing. It's not 6 digits, especially given how Parasite was disproportionately not as negatively affected by the reserve nerfs compared to other exotic heavies. The big thing with Parasite that I want to point out is that it provides a 15% boost to your other weapons when you do some self-damage. That's a lot. That's a lot. 15% on top of something like Mint Retrograde propels it past most of the heavies, you know, if any of the heavies are even above it. Most of the heavies that are above it. Great stuff from Parasite. It donates total damage, you could say, to your other weapons, so it increases their reserves, in, you know, technically speaking. And I think it'll be a great pairing with stuff like Yeartide and PKs. And, you know, I think Worm Byproduct is a pretty underrated exotic effect, and we'll definitely be exploring that in our rotation ranking series, and, you know, talking about Parasite and what other special weapons they could be buffing. And the last special case I wanted to talk about is Finality's Augur. Now, you might have seen this in the Zemo video where it was used to do some chip damage while people were casting their super, because the turret lasts a pretty long time. It's like 20-25 seconds, so it lasts a really, really long time. The swap DPS, if you manage to proc bait, is 10.6k, which is pretty decent because the turret literally lasts for like 25 seconds and you only have to spend like 2 seconds putting it down, right? So it's a lot of total damage that you can do while you're kind of swapping to a different weapon or casting a super or something like that. And the total damage is 163k, which requires you to do 7 turrets, which there's no damage phase in the game that's long enough for 7 turrets to be relevant. But, you know, it helps with ammo economy, and you can use it for your ad clear as well, so it's not too bad. I would say Finality's Augur, it's not always relevant, but it's definitely carved out a niche for itself, where in some cases it might be useful, and I would argue that nowadays, after all the changes to it, it has better quality of life than Anarchy, because Anarchy, you have to stick 2 traps, which is pretty easy. You don't need to hold left click or anything. You just stick and you're done. But some boss models don't jive well with Anarchy necessarily. And Anarchy also has, you know, the traps are not like auto-targeting in the same way that Finality's turret is. And the biggest thing is Anarchy traps only last 10 seconds. Finality's turret lasts like 25. So compared to, you know, an average phase where you might be doing DPS for 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, Finality's Augur, you're going to have to place basically a max of 2 turrets for most phases, whereas Anarchy, you're constantly going to be needing to restick, and eventually, if you're sticking 2 at a time, if the phase is longer than 30 seconds, you're going to need to manually reload Anarchy, which is definitely going to cut into its DPS as well. Okay, so that's it for special cases. Finally, let's talk about our summary. So not really surprising stuff here. I would say in 90% of scenarios, maybe 95% of scenarios, just use the crossbow. Just use the crossbow, get yourself an explosive roll, 6,000 plus DPS. Min retrograde's at 3.5k. We already talked about how OP that is. I guess 4.8k is the number we should be comparing to because that's with temporal. 6k plus DPS, infinite total damage, crazy versatile for mechanics and ad clear. A lot of people don't think about this, but when you're using something like a rocket or a linear, you generally try not to use it on ads because you're not going to get that ammo back. Whereas with this bow, you can shoot every single ad that you want in the encounter with the bow. You could do the whole encounter with just your bow on and use no other weapon and be totally fine. You'll be full ammo for damage. So crazy versatile for mechanics and ad clear. You have perk swap options that you can use to generate ammo in terms of like field prep, and then you can swap like bolt scavenger for damage. You can run dragonfly or firefly for ad clear, and then you can swap off that. But this bow is absolutely temporal made. Once temporal blast is gone, total damage is going to drop off a cliff, DPS is going to drop off a cliff, and it's going to be pretty swept under the rug in my opinion. Next, we have optimized DPS. Now, just read the note here. Technically higher DPS than Opaque in certain circumstances if you choose to abuse stuff like Reaper's Tithe and Frame of Reference, and you do enough damage stacking that maybe you get a temporal blast more often than, you know, once every 2 shots. But really, unless you're a speedrunner, just use the bow. 6,000 DPS for just shooting a bow is like too much to pass up. It's just too much to pass up. Maybe you can get to 7k or 8k if you like optimize with the rocket a bit more, but 6k plus is already like, this is the easiest access that we've had to DPS this high in quite a while. And so 6 people just on this bow or 5 people on the bow and 1 tractor, you're going to melt through everything. You're going to one phase every raid boss, every dungeon boss in this game. It's not even close. Okay. And then finally, the balanced option. So I only list this here because day 1 raid race is coming up. We're going to be, you know, doing the epic raid race. And more than likely, temporal blast is either going to be disabled or is going to be nerfed. The crossbow is probably going to be disabled or nerfed. And outbreak, blah, blah, blah. A lot of different weapons are probably going to be disabled or nerfed. And unlikely to be nerfed is Parasite and its accompanying weapons like Mint Retrograde. Even Mint Retrograde without, by the way, Temporal Blast is still pretty good. It's still pretty good with Parasite because of that 15% damage increase. So Parasite Mint should be able to take care of, you know, really any boss that you throw in its way. And then, of course, you guys have the classic PK swaps and stuff like that. But that's not really relevant to a heavy weapon video. But really, the description kind of describes this aptly. In case of emergency, disables, break glass, and use worm launcher. Shout out worm byproduct. So that's pretty much all I have to say about heavy weapons. Yeah, not a particularly interesting discussion. I mean, hopefully you guys gained some insight on some of the lower performing heavy weapons in this game right now, but the summary just comes down to go into Desert Perpetual, get yourself a bow with explosive bolts, and shoot the enemies with your new fun seasonal mod on. That's basically it. I hope you guys enjoyed. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about abilities, which should be potentially pretty interesting. I'm going to go over lots of stuff from throwing hammer to grapple melee to nade damage. Lots of stuff to talk about there. But for now, have a good one, and I hope you enjoyed this video.